reactionary, progressive, localist, globalist? How do our climate politics line up? This panel today will explore the history of environmentalism as a way of thinking about the spectrum of political positions and in climate response. We're going to be joined by a lively panel today, and I'll introduce them in a moment, but I want to say first that this is the first of the academic year 2024's conversations on Europe. This is a series that has been going on since 2012, so we're in our 12th year. And I'm delighted to be leading this series. My name is Randall Halle, and I'm the director of the European Studies Center here, the Jean Monnet EU Center of Excellence at the University of Pittsburgh. And because it is a Jean Monnet EU Center of Excellence, I want to say thank you to our primary funder, the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. For that funding, we're grateful. And I'd also like to thank Erica, Ingrid, and Jordan for their work in setting things up here. So as we address this topic, I will introduce each speaker first and give them an opportunity to respond to an opening question. And after we've gone around with our speakers, we will open up into a free discussion. At that point, you will have an opportunity to ask questions, you being all the people here in the room. And if you have questions, you can raise your hand, but also those people who are online, as this is a hybrid format. And for those of you who are online, feel free to post a question at any time during the session. We recommend that you use the question and answer rather than the chat function, and we'll try to get to as many questions and engagements as possible here. So these are all wonderful people. The only person that might be intimidating is here to my further right. So I hope that everybody should be interested and engaged. Let me begin by introducing our first panelist of three, Stefan Wyhl, who is an assistant professor of European politics and is currently at the Rachel Carson Center at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. And he is the author of Greening Democracy, the Anti-Nuclear Movement in West Germany and Beyond. And his research has been about the particular emergence of the Greens in Germany, this very important history of the first major Green Party on the planet. And he's also been focusing on this history a little bit more broadly of late. So we have a perfect person to help us think historically here, especially turning back to the 70s and 80s. And Stephen, help expand our understanding here of what was happening in the 70s and 80s that actually generated the emergence of the Greens as a party in Germany, but also the Greens in general.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, and it's really a pleasure to get to be part of this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. So yeah, thank you all very much. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, I mean, as I see it, I would say there are kind of two different, there are many developments, but two that I would focus on that lead up to the emergence of the Greens as a political party. And I think around 1970, environmentalism emerged in Western Europe in two different ways. And one was sort of a bureaucratic form of environmentalism, a discovery from government officials that this was sort of a unified area of policymaking. It wasn't new, the idea that there were problems that had to do with pollution. There had been legislation and political work dealing with that for a very long time. But the idea that a whole set of problems fit together as environmental policy reflected, for example, in the founding of environmental ministries or environmental environmental departments. This is something new around the 1970s. So just sort of an idea of putting these problems together, of calling them environmental problems as opposed to particular problems of pollution or of industry on the one hand. And on the other hand, and I think it was really important at the very beginning for the emergence of the Greens, is sort of the way that citizens started to deal with a set of related problems. They didn't, I think for a lot of people on the ground at the grassroots, the fact that, government officials were creating a new ministry or redirecting which ministry in West Germany, there was no environmental ministry till 1986. So there, for example, it was just a matter of which minister took over a portfolio of problems. These were not that important to people on the ground, but sort of a set of local problems, things that really mattered to them in their lives, were becoming more important. One thing that in Germany and also in France was incredibly important at that moment was nuclear energy, and just the idea that all of the sudden nuclear reactors could be sited all over the place. And that's a big change from how energy was produced previously, because it's a lot harder to build a coal-fired power plant wherever you want, because you need to get the coal there, so that has to be taken into account. But with nuclear energy, there's less that you need to bring there, and also there are other considerations about where you can site it, like that you need a huge source of cooling water. So people who lived in rural places that happened to be near a big river or a big lake or the sea were suddenly being told that, these areas were great places for new centers of industry that would be based around new nuclear power plants. And I think the way that people dealt with that problem and the things it caused them to think about when they imagined that utilities company executives or government officials who are in charge of making these kind of decisions had decided basically to locate these new power plants right where they lived, became very problematic. And it led first and foremost, not necessarily to concerns about protecting nature, but to concerns a lot about protecting their hometowns, their ways of life. But those things also kind of engaged people to become involved in politics and decision-making in new ways, and to rethink old electoral allegiances. And that, in the long run, opened the way for new political parties like the Greens. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that while the Green Party is as one outcome of this political, of this engagement with environmental problems from the grassroots up, it's not the only one. There were a lot of other things that came out of this, and a lot of new research institutes dealing with environmental problems to try to help people on the ground who were affected by them and felt like in many cases that they were sort of being overwhelmed by the government's take on things to get them information. So scientists engaging in new ways with environmental problems and wanting to share their expertise with the public as one example. Also, whole kinds of new media and magazines and new radio stations, even all kinds of things like that emerged out of these debates around nuclear energy, kind of formed a new framework for participation. And this, even though it sounds like it doesn't have so much to do with environmental problems per se, I think is really important to how people engage with the environment and how the environment came to be something that, a whole new political party should be based around, as opposed to just one of many concerns. So from my perspective, I would say that those are two really key developments that led to the formation of the Green Party, for one thing, or of environmentalism becoming an important political topic. And I think there's been a big development since then, and there's been a lot of changes in the way environmentalism has been talked about, but hopefully those are things we can discuss throughout the conversation.
So, and I just want to follow up with maybe one or two observations or further question, and that is, it's interesting, 1986, and the formation of the ministry in Germany is also kind of across Europe directly related to Chernobyl and to the nuclear disaster and that experience there. And that, so there's also something about nuclear energy that is very present. And I think one of the other things I remember of the discussions back then was that not only could you position them in remote places, but you could also position them in places where the fallout would go across the border to other people, right? And that also led to a kind of thinking across the border and coalitions that might otherwise not have existed within these movements. But just a follow-up kind of question for you. I remember very much the images of the Green Party entering into Parliament. They wore beards, the men were knitting their own sweaters, they wore jeans and sneakers, and they put them up on the tables. Right, yeah, they brought, exactly, they brought flowers and this sort of stuff. And one of the things that I was told at the time is that they didn't want to sit. It was a hard thing to figure out where to actually position them within Parliament, because Parliament was set up to be right and left, and where they were to go was an open question, and they were insistent that they wanted to be some other place and mess up the spectrum. And I ask that as a way of asking us to think about this kind of general right, left, progressive, not progressive, and you've already said there's origins here, but maybe you could just say briefly something about how did the Greens, and you've already identified participatory democracy, but how did the Greens mess up the spectrum?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the Greens, as you basically alluded to, the Greens slogan was, neither left nor right, but ahead. And so that's how they envisioned themselves. And yeah, exactly. It's very hard to figure out where in a parliament you seat someone who says our political position is ahead, not on the right or the left. So yeah, I think environmentalism, I think one of the ways that you can see how environmentalism changes the political spectrum is if you look at who from the very beginning of the modern environmental movement, as we talk about it, was engaged with this. If you look at the beginnings of the 1970s, if you look at these grassroots kind of struggles that were in West Germany, certainly, but in a lot of other places too, the beginnings of the environmental movement, there were a lot of people who we would perceive as being conservative. I mean, if you look at opponents to nuclear reactors, many of them were consistent voters for the Christian Democrats. In fact, that's one of the Conservative Party in Germany, and it's one of the things that actually sort of like motivated them to get engaged to such an extent, because they had voted for a government that that they thought would be responsive then to their concerns, and then they didn't kind of get the satisfaction that they wanted when they said, hey, if you build this nuclear reactor here, you're going to ruin my farm or my vineyard. And that caused them to rethink things. It didn't necessarily cause them to become radical leftists, but it caused them to question sort of how democracy worked. And I think then you have this what's often called like value conservatism aspect to environmentalism also. So people who are interested in preserving a certain set of values, things that were important to them, but that still didn't quite fit in with the traditional conservative parties. So it's an important aspect. And of course, you also have leftists who didn't know where to go with the end of the student movement and saw environmental activism as one place, or Green parties in particular as one place where they could get involved. So you have people coming from a lot of different backgrounds and trying to work together, and it becomes very unclear where they fit on the left and right spectrum. And I think that's something that over time has continued to be a problem or a challenge of how we understand environmentalism.
Or a dynamic that is often unattended, because it is often still the perception that being an environmentalist puts you ahead, right, of the others in some ways in that same slogan. But that sets it up perfectly for me to turn to our colleague here to my right. And I'd like to introduce Isa Ding, who is currently a fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, a very, very, very prestigious fellowship. And we're honored to have her here, even though she's at the Academy in Berlin. She's currently here in Pittsburgh for a moment, so we're very happy about that. She is otherwise an associate professor at Northwestern, having left Pittsburgh about 3 years ago to go to Northwestern. We don't hold it against her. 1 year ago, we don't hold it against her. But Isa is currently researching the relationship, indeed, of the far right to environmentalism. It's a question for me maybe of how far right. Is it conservative, or is it actually the far right that you're interested in? But for us also, and important for this conversation, she brings in previous work in which she has engaged the global environmental movement and thinking about especially China and Chinese environmentalism. So we can just think, and I'll expand myself for a second here, that if we just focus on the Greens in Germany, there's another aspect of the 70s that's important for us to think about, and that's Greenpeace. So a year before the Greens, the Greenpeace forms international headquarters in Amsterdam, which is really a culmination of over a decade of anti-nuclear, anti-whaling activity, not unlike something of what Stephen was describing with the Greens. So a kind of grassroots anti-establishment and on a political spectrum, unclear perhaps, but coming out of North America with now a global influence. And we already alluded to Chernobyl. And let's just say that 1986 was also another important year for the environmental movement in the East Bloc. And many say that, for instance, the Ukrainian opposition forms out of an environmentalist response to Soviet nuclear strategies at the time. And that expands throughout all the East Bloc. So all of that very broad as a kind of opening question for you. But could you bring in some addition to what Stephen was saying to us, and maybe talk to us a little bit about your research that you're currently doing?
Yeah, for sure. The 60s and 70s indeed was a very important turning point, and what Mark would, we could kind of Stephen refers to as the modern environmental movement. And another thing that was, another feature of the 70s was that the global Maoist movement, if you will. Rachel Carson's book was very influential, not just in the West, but also in places like China, but also Maoism was kind of a popular idea coming out of the Cultural Revolution, where the West had much information about China. So a lot of the early environmentalists in Germany and elsewhere, they were Maoists at the very beginning. A lot of them, as they became older, became more liberal, centrist, but then they were originally kind of further to the left. And then as the Green Party, the Green Movement originally in Germany had people from all spectrum, if you will, from the far left to the far right. And then gradually the right sort of left, and especially the far right sort of left the movement. And that's a part of what I'm working on. But I'm going to focus my remarks on the far right, if you will. And I want to actually start with an anecdote and observation I made. So last spring, before I left Pittsburgh, I went to a debate between the college Democrats and college Republicans at Pitt. And then the students over there, they debated every single issue from immigration to abortion to any of the major issues in the presidential elections. And then when it came to the environment and climate change, everybody was shocked that they were in agreement. So the question was, okay, is climate change real? Is it serious? And then the Democrats spoke first, and they're like, yeah, it's a serious problem with that. And then the Republican students were, yeah, we agree. Climate change is real. Climate change is important. And then both sides laughed. They debated, they fought vehemently over every single issue, but then they laughed when they realized they were in agreement about climate change. And then this indeed, speaks to the changing trend in beliefs amongst different generations. So if we look at survey data, young Republicans in the United States overwhelmingly believe that climate change is real. It's a serious problem. So there's a very, very clear generation shift. However, it doesn't mean that people agree on the solution. So you can very much see, and I do observe that, right? Some of the Republican politicians, older or younger, they say, well, the immigrants are polluting our country, and anti-immigration is very much consistent with environmental protection. But I mostly work on ideas, and I'm working on this book on kind of the evolution of environmentalism as an idea, going from conservative to liberal, and then to today, which I think is more contested. And I'll just kind of talk about ideas, and especially ideas about environmentalism for the far right, if we will, although some of them would perhaps refer to themselves not as the far right, but as the ultra-right or as paleo-conservative, which is a very, very interesting term. And obviously, we could, I think we're all in agreement that the traditional left and right spectrum is no longer adequate in capturing not just environmental beliefs, but everything else we're worried about. And I think, you know, for the sake of not spending our entire session just defining what is right, what is left, I will just use the right to refer loosely to those that hold political positions that perhaps are in tension, if not opposed to Enlightenment ideals such as universalism and cosmopolitanism. And then when we think of environmentalists and the right, our immediate assumption again is that, you know, those people don't agree with each other. Environmentalism is a liberal agenda, and then the right wing or conservatives, they tend to reject climate change and the importance of environmental protection. As I've mentioned just now, I think this is less likely to be where the political conflict is going to be at, in my view, in 5 to 10 years. And I think we're seeing the emergence, if not the re-emergence, of a right-wing environmental movement, both specifically in terms of actual social movements such as Anastasia, a very, very interesting far-right environmental movement that was born in Russia, but now is popular in Eastern Europe, the eastern part of Germany, but I've also found them in the United States as well. But also the idea of that, which can be traced, as we know, back to the earlier 20th century, if not earlier. And I think I will just start from the very beginning and then still finish my remarks in about 3 to 5 minutes. So this is the notion of purity, and I think very, very briefly, this right-wing environmentalism could be characterized as the belief that environmental pollution and cultural pollution go hand in hand, and therefore the preservation of nature and the preservation of culture also go hand in hand. And then purity is the kind of the notion that underlie right-wing environmental ideology, and this interest in purity can be traced all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans. Historian Nell Pincher, retired from Princeton, documented kind of the Roman conquest as it moved westward and northward. They started to, in their imagination, separate the Germans from the Gauls from the Celts. So the Celts in the original kind of thinking about race, right? So the Germans were the Germani, in Latin meant genuine. So they were the genuine Gauls, were big, blunt, wild, simple, and warlike because of their harsh environment they had to live in. So while the Romans kind of thought themselves as representatives of civilization, then the Germans became, in their imagination, the original noble savage who represented kind of masculinity and virility. And then, so I just want to kind of read this paragraph really quickly from Tacitus, and this was documented in Pincher's book. So the inhabitants of Germania have not been tainted by any intermarriage with other tribes, but have existed as a distinct and pure people. They have the same physical appearance, fierce blue eyes, tawny hair, bodies that are big but strong only in attack. And the key here is, right, why are the Germans pure? So the answer is because they live in harsh environmental conditions. So Tacitus writes, who would abandon Asia or Africa or Italy and to seek out Germania with its unlovely landscape and harsh climate, juried inhabitants, and behold, if it were not one's native land, right? So then in the 19th century, racial theorists, then they freely invoked Tacitus and also Caesar and others to prove their claims of German racial purity. And then they combined those historical accounts with Darwinism, which became social Darwinism, and this gave rise to the eugenics movement and policies that aim to improve the human stock in Europe and also across the Atlantic here. So now at this point, right, if we were familiar with Darwin's theories, we might ask, well, shouldn't a true follower of Charles Darwin and science also recognize that natural selection gave rise to diversity of species, and thus they should be a champion of diversity? And this is a very interesting question because their answer would be, and then I know their answer because I've been for my research reading a lot of the forums for the far right, and those are where the people who we would call far right from different parts of the world would go and chat with each other and then kind of clarify their own thinking and so forth. So they would say that they actually fully respect diversity, but at a global scale. So nature is indeed diverse, and the diversity of nature with its various landscapes and climate conditions shape the diversity of culture. And for this reason, people from different cultures belong to their own natural environment. And if they've moved, they should go back to their own natural environment. And the world would therefore remain a diverse space made up of internally pure groups, national groups, each confined to their own natural landscape. And then Europe, therefore, is for Europeans, and Asia is for Asians, and Africa is for Africans, and therefore a true environmentalist, in their view, would then protect the diversity of nature as well as the diversity of culture at a global scale. And the best way to do that is to prevent and to limit interaction between different cultures. And the idea is, okay, if we restrict what kind of plants and animal species we can bring across national borders, so as to not disrupt the native ecosystem of a country, then why can't we extend this logic to humans? And those commentaries can be found readily on these right-wing forums online. So, and they also have sections kind of explicitly devoted to nature and environment. Again, many of them would say, we're not really anti-environmental. In fact, we're very, very pro-environment. And then just to conclude, this is to say that to some people on the right, there is nothing fundamentally anti-environmental about their beliefs. And this is why many of them wouldn't call themselves far right, and they're more comfortable with notions of alt-right or paleocons, and many of them live in kind of a lifestyle that is kind of back to the land, that seek to unite with the earth as this organic whole. And some are Christians in terms of their religious beliefs, but others are anti-Christian. So we often, again, associate the far right or right with Christianity, a lot of them, and instead of hope that we can go back to the pagan era, where we have not just one God, but multiple gods, and we kind of live in this kind of, kind of avatar-like universe, right, with nature as a whole. And again, I think there's nothing fundamentally wrong with homesteading, right? I think self-sufficiency is a very attractive idea for most people, and eating organic is a very attractive idea. Being an organic whole with the universe is a very attractive idea, and this is why the Rouse poems are so powerful, and to liberals and people others are like. But of course, when taken to an extreme, even the most benevolent ideas could also become very dangerous. But I think without recognizing the power of ideas and understanding where they come from, we'll not be able to arrive at sound judgments and viable solutions to the differences within our society. So I think I'll just end here, but there's so much to say about this. This obviously doesn't just exist as a realm of ideas, but also there are concrete social movements and concrete movements that some of them are global in the sense that they're connected through networks, social networks, and others are global, even though they don't communicate with each other, but they are the transmission of idea kind of spread those ideas kind of more globally. So
I appreciate that. I mean, there's a number of things that you've highlighted for us. At least some of these aspects actually lead us into our next participant, Pat Manning's current research. But I want to underscore, it seems to me that language then of something like invasive species at this point, which is a real phenomenon, especially in Pittsburgh with its lanternflies and a number of other things that we exactly. But so there's a way in which, okay, that's a concern, but on the within the paleo we might say invasive species are also people, migrants, yes, and other people belong where they belong. I think it's also important that you're helping us see a distinction amongst generations and also a potential distinction between, say, the way that this kind of ideational conservatism and a economic conservatism might be functioning here.
Yeah, and I want to clarify what I'm talking about in the second part is a small group of people. This is not, I don't want to reduce the entire kind of, what we call the right or conservatives to that. But this, small movement and kind of highlight the fact that there is nothing kind of fundamentally anti-environmental, right? There is this potential for the two spectrums to meet or become the circle, and then for but it also means that I guess the struggle for the environment and to fight climate change doesn't just end at kind of recognizing environmental pollution is a problem and climate change is real.
Environmentalism seems to reflect the way that we approach our conception of society rather than environmentalism defining the way that we organize society. And I think that I appreciate that observation. It also means, therefore, what we're hearing from you and from Stephen, that environmentalism intersects with all forms of political organization in some way. But that there's shifts going on. Let me turn us to Pat Manning. Pat Manning is an Andrew Mellon Professor of World History Emeritus at the University of Pittsburgh. From 2008 to 2015, Pat and I came to Pittsburgh in the same cohort around the same time. So I was blessed to be able to meet him as I was also fresh at Pittsburgh. During that time, he was the founding director of the World History Center and really created something here within the Dietrich School, within our School of Arts and Sciences, something that's left a grand mark on the way that historians think about the world, think about world history. And for that, Pat is really a central figure. He has, he was originally an Africanist and then switched over into this focus on the world. And I remember fondly the last of a series of lectures that he held here at Pitt, in which he talked about world history as the history of the world, from its origins, Big Bang, to the present, and all sorts of different ways of zooming in to scale and out to scale. It was just a fascinating conversation with you at that point in time. But I know that actually one of the things that you've also been focusing on now is what, if we've been talking about the politics in the party, Pat, you've been also thinking about the economics and various aspects of green economics, which we want to be thinking about. But I'm wondering if we could if we could approach it from this role as world historian. And as I said, the way that you presented the world, recent history is just a blip. But it is a blip that's changing the world in a very dramatic way. And so I'm wondering if there's something here that you as a global historian would add to the conversation about political transformations in the environmentalist movement that we've been hearing so far.
Thank you, Randall. Yes, it's nice to think back to the time when we just arrived and each was setting things up. That was a good time. I'm as Randall says, trained as a historian of Africa, which involves necessarily being multidisciplinary in one's approach. Uh, but I've never been a specialist really in environment. And on the other hand, I keep finding that one cannot escape environmental issues and that they are, in a sort of preternatural sense, really very cross-disciplinary, and rehearse one in thinking what world history requires, which is the ability to sustain thought on several topics at once. But I will try to boil it down here by making just a few points that are not uh, Stefan and Issa have given us the core of the discussion here on politics in Europe, especially in Germany, and environmental issues, and centering on that turning point of the 1970s. So I hope I can address a few other issues that can be wrapped around these and perhaps inform the core discussion. First is the question of the knowledge about the environment. As of 1950, precious little was known about any aspect of the environment of the world. Not that zoology and biology had learned nothing, but we didn't know about the continents, we didn't know about the atmosphere, we didn't know about the interactions of ecology. That's one point that I'll follow up in a bit more. Second, in the post-war era, and quite dramatically in Europe, but also in North America and Japan, there was rapid industrial growth. And the rapid industrial post-war growth led necessarily to immense amount of pollution and poisoning and so forth. And the individual local disasters of the 1950s and the 60s were the things that generated the social movements that became powerful by the late 1960s, the same time as other sorts of social movements were growing. So the curious and central experience of Germany of having an ongoing discussion on environmentalism and on the institution of the Greens is one sort of result. In the United States, there was a very powerful creation of a movement with Earth Day and so forth, and the government backed off, and there was a brief period of a lot of environmental legislation, but also the corporate response to the environmental legislation was such that environmentalism in the United States almost disappeared from the mid-1970s on. And the third example is that of Japan, where actually it may be that the bureaucratic response was earliest by a year or so, and where a pretty strong system of environmental regulation was set up that lasted in Japan from the 1970s to the 1990s. So the different directions of environmentalism are of interest. Now, on knowledge, just to say very, very briefly that it's only in the 1960s and 70s that it was understood how continental drift works, how the long-term variations in the temperature of the Earth could be measured, and that attention to the atmosphere began. So only in 1958 did research begin on how much carbon dioxide was increasing in its concentration in the atmosphere. And the nature of the result, that more carbon dioxide means warmer temperature, was long understood, but to see that it might actually be influential in the short term was new. And in the most important single piece of research, Shukuro Manabe, a Japanese PhD who went to work at Princeton University, did work from 1965 to 1970 with a simple, 65 to 67, did a simple model of the atmosphere that showed that a doubling in the concentration of carbon dioxide would lead to a rise of 3 degrees Celsius in the Earth's temperature. Well, the average temperature of the Earth was understood not to have varied more than 10 degrees Celsius over the entire expanse of life on Earth, so that we were talking about the potential of a really dramatic change. That stimulated the growth in what were first small individual projects, but ultimately large-scale collaborative research projects, well funded by the U.S. government. And so within 20 years, the operation of the global climate system was understood, not completely, but to a really substantial degree. And in 1988, the United Nations supported the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is an organization that was to report on research results on climate change and to suggest information on the risk of change, how serious the change would be, and what one could do to limit the change in global warming. They did very well on assessing the risk of change. Their projections on the impact of growing carbon dioxide concentration have been quite precise. But where they were weak was understanding what to do in prevention. That is to say, as scientific and technical folks, they proposed such things as simply reducing the amount of fossil fuels that were used as a way to slow the growth in temperature. But they had no way to prepare themselves for what would be the corporate response to that. But I do want to emphasize the great advance in scientific knowledge and how scientific knowledge continues to move ahead. The unsolved part is the political part, and that's the part that we're trying to concentrate on here. Now, the additional topics that I would want to point to, I won't take the time to explore them in much detail, are on the one hand, governmental alliances, international alliances ranging across the earth. The Cold War alliances was perhaps the dominant one in this area, but with the independence of so many former colonies, the G77 group formed in 1964 as 77 members of the United States, of the United Nations, who wanted to reorganize trade relations in such a way that they would have equal rights to the big powers. And the response was in the 1975 formation of the G7, the most powerful Western capitalist economies, which focused primarily on strengthening their own self, on limiting any change that would benefit the ex-colonial countries. And there's an interesting balance and shift in organizations. The G7 and the G77 still exist, but in the meantime, G20 has formed, BRICS has formed, and we have a balance of several different meetings of overlapping international groupings talking about major policy issues, including environmental issues. That's one. But the other one that needs more attention than it gets in these discussions is the growth of multinational enterprises. So especially at the end of the Second World War, the American economy was dominant worldwide. American investment funds began to spread first to Europe through the Marshall Plan, and then to Japan in support of the Korean War, and then beyond that to other places. And so multinational enterprises became a factor. that were governed in different ways. And since then, they have grown. In fact, they've grown so much that multinational enterprises have gone from a minuscule portion of the global economy to at least 30% of the global economy. And latest estimates suggest that it's even up to 2/3 of global trade. And then my final point is to point at the academic study of multinational enterprises. So within business schools, a group of economists began studying multinational enterprises. And in many ways, they did a good job, but they looked only at the multinational enterprises themselves, their strategies, their lobbying techniques, their dealing with the problems of gender and cultural differences amongst the multinational staffs that ran the big firms. These are the sorts of things that have been studied by the Academy of International Business. And what was left out was any study of the impact of multinational enterprises on the world economy as a whole. So only in the last 5 to 10 years has the OECD, the European Union's big think tank, has it begun to ask, when multinational corporations expand, what happens to the labor, the land, the economic life that was previously dominant in the countries where multinational enterprises have taken hold. And all of these are debates significant enough in themselves that the questions of environmental degradation are commonly left out. The political demands that come from every sector calling for economic growth mean that the call that comes out of the environmental movement for a halt to growth is rarely heard. So this is a set of dynamics that have their interesting new developments in at the World Economic Forum in Davos and so forth, but where common people and local groups about whom we've heard from both the previous speakers have a difficult time in getting their voices heard. There we are. Those are patterns that are somewhat general and that are handled differently in each country. And I do think that the German example is, just because of the strength of the and the range of debate in environmentalism within that country, is going to be very influential worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's it.
No, it intrigues me in just tying into what you tying things together with what you just said. One of the things for us, certainly, when you speak about sort of the colonial and decolonial past, is to underscore that really is a European legacy. That the way that the kind of post-colonial economies are structured and their orientation towards extraction or industry, those are all things that were really largely determined by the Europeans and the way that they continue to invest with development funds, especially in Africa, where you, with which you're very familiar. But it seems to me that you've opened up for us, again, this kind of interesting complexity here, because corporations related to oil are one thing, but tech is another, and then there's a whole Elon Musk situation opening up battery factories in Europe, and et cetera, et cetera. So I want to remind everybody that they're more than welcome to raise questions, just here in the room, raise your hand on anything that's going on here, or stuff that's not even going on here in the room. And also likewise for those colleagues who are joining us hybrid, please just post a question in the Q&A, and Ingrid, you'll let me know if something comes up. And just
I'm Sabine van Dilke. I'm a professor in the German department. And I lived through the 60s and, well, I was just born in the 60s, but the 70s and 80s until I left for the US, actually in West Germany through this phase which Stephen, you addressed. So first of all, I want to thank you all for a very, painting a very complex picture, which is necessary to understand and maybe also think through possibilities to get results from the environmental movement. I'm not so optimistic because, sorry, but the Germans now that they are freezing thanks to banking on the Russian gas. They are not actually as environmentally inclined right now as they have been. There's a huge retreat from that. But I want to mention before, do a little bit more PR. This is actually part of a longer sequence of events sponsored by the European Studies Center, but also with a grant from the German Embassy entitled Sustainability and Climate Change, Environmentalism in Germany. Please go to the German department website, or also the European Studies Center. Next, in 2 weeks, we have someone talking actually about our favorite hobby, namely the gaming industry, and what that does, or what kind of energy it requires to sit there and do it all night. So please join us for that in about 2 weeks. But I want to make a few comments and also have a few questions. The first one is addressed to Stephen, maybe for clarification. You gave us, you said, you qualified it that there were numerous factors which led to the rise of an environmental movement in West Germany. But then it wasn't quite clear to me because you seem to indicate that there was also a sense of policy making early on, and I could disagree with that. If you look at how long it took West Germany, filthy rich country, to finally get a Bundesministerium of the Umweltschutz, blah, 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 off the ground in 1986, that tells us something about the opposition, even under the SPD government, when the SPD was voted out of power, but, to the whole environmentalism. So I would say the environmentalism and the success in Germany was really driven by the citizen initiatives. It came from the ground up. Then I would like to just clarify that I would like you to also maybe comment on, but that goes also to you, is this issue in Germany that you had early on a substantial, and I liked when you said, Stephen, the Wertkonservative, the value conservative people coming on board in rural areas to protect the land. But I think they weren't necessarily the driving force. My research was more focused also a little bit on ideas, but also on the movement itself. I would say it was very much driven by the younger generation and in the urban areas first. But then we would go to particularly the nuclear power plant issues. We would go with the buses. I'm from the southwest to Fessenheim in France, or to up north to Wyhl. And then the tractors came as a sort of a secondary thing. But so I would say, the rural urban split needs to be, or also more educated, go to, educated people in the urban areas were sort of the driving force in the younger generation. So, but maybe you could comment a little bit on that. And also with the AKWs, with the nuclear power plants, don't forget, here next door, 3 Mile Island, I will never forget that, and that really jolted people out of their seats, basically, even these Wertkonservative. That was all over the German press. That was I remember the turning point where people started to get really nervous because, and I just recently saw a documentary on that again, what happened in 3 Mile Island was really a wake up. And to this date, people there are suffering. So, but if you could spell that out a little bit more, because I would say the Greens, and then remember the Greens, the first time didn't get into the Bundestag because we had Franz Josef Strauss, not quite as bad as Trump, vying for chancellorship in 1982, but sort of that ilk. So the reason why they came somewhat delayed had a lot to do with the political landscape. Then for Isa, I have a question, whether you could comment a little bit, since when you said it about China, Yeah, because my understanding was always actually very destructive to be more environmentally, but I'm not an expert on China, environmentally sound practices on the countryside, which then due to the moving forward seem to be destroying these existing networks cultivated and environmentally safer, than what happened then. But then interestingly, and that would, again, support also what happened in Germany, if I understand it correctly, you have a huge environmental movement now in the urban areas in China since about 2005, 7. Yeah, the educated urban Chinese population is pressing for environmental things, and there's this big tree planting thing. I don't know how many million in what part of China, but there's a huge movement, but it came again from the bottom up, that the Chinese government is under pressure because this very important educated urban middle class, that's what I know from the press, is very, can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit? And then
Okay.
last now one question. Henry, could you talk a little bit more, because I was so happy to hear when you talked about the early, particularly in the 70s in Germany, it was called the Nullwachstum, the problem with which we have with the capitalist economy based on growth. And that was the whole thing with Wyhl and building back better. I meant like, great, here we go again. Because, I would be curious whether you could talk a little bit more about, or give us some more ideas, maybe we should have an economist here. What do we actually need to do? Because in Germany, the discussion of the economist was that you have to rebuild the whole economic sphere and industry in order to get away from that growth paradigm, which is so destructive. Thank you.
All right, that's quite a demanding series of questions. So, Stephen, well, exactly. Actually, we definitely want not to leave these conversations with a sense of fatality and darkness, but rather really explore what it is that's possible for us. Stephen, do you want to tell my colleague, Professor van Derken, how wrong she is, or?
Yeah, sure. I'm very happy to answer those questions. Thanks so much for all of the questions and comments. I really appreciate that. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of truth to some of the points that you've made, but I also have other ways of looking at some of the things that you've pointed out. So, I mean, of course, I would agree with you that the West German government was a relative latecomer to environmental policy making and was perceived as following behind, for example, the United States, which was at that point the leader in environmental policy making. But it's also not true that nothing happened. I mean, and this is exactly what I find so interesting and compelling, which is that on the one hand, the German government under the Social Democrats, and actually it was the Free Democrats, FDP, that really pushed this forward as the junior partner, put through a tremendous amount of environmental legislation in the 1970s, but it didn't address a lot of the problems that people in places like Wyhl, as you mentioned, a nuclear power plant site in southwestern Germany, were concerned about. So at the same time, as the government was talking a big game about the environmental policies it was putting into place, and it passed numerous laws, they weren't addressing the concerns that people had. And a lot of those concerns had to do simply with finding a way to talk about the problems that really bothered them, that the government didn't seem to understand as problems, because it didn't see building new nuclear power plants as a threat to the environment, for example, which people on the ground did see. And so I see two different stories, and that's what I was trying to emphasize in my comments at the beginning of the 70s in Germany as far as environmental concerns, as environmentalism is concerned. And one is this sort of bottom-up story that you emphasized, that you talked about how you participated in also. And the other is this bureaucratic one. And there's no doubt that that happened, even if it was after the United States, and even if it didn't address a lot of the concerns. I do agree with you that the bottom-up sort of grassroots aspect has had a huge influence. And I also think that that's the main place where the Green Party has come from. And we could debate how important the Green Party specifically is for Germany's environmental achievements and what it means for them, and what other sorts of environmental modes of doing environmental politics also mean for those things. And I think that's a very interesting discussion. But the last thing that I really wanted to point out in relation to all of that is just the extent to which the rise of the Greens as a factor contributed actually to in the 1980s, when the conservatives under Kohl came into power, talking a huge game about the environment and nonstop. I mean, this is a big part of the reason that in 1986 there finally was a Ministry of the Environment in West Germany, because Kohl personally decided that that was part of his reaction to Chernobyl, but also because the Ministry of the Environment could represent West Germany on the international stage and try to help make this reputation for the country as an environmental leader, and something that really if you look at Kohl's speeches, or if you look at the speeches of Klaus Töpfer, who was the second Minister of the Environment, was also a Christian Democrat, but someone who actually cared quite deeply about the environment, I would argue. They're full of references to Germany, West Germany being the leader on climate change, the leader in Europe on environmental problem solving, which makes no sense based on the history that you've mentioned, that Germany was a latecomer, but actually is something that reputation they set out to build. And they were successful in part by talking so much about it and by having some policies and some focus on exactly this point that you brought up last about the relationship between economy and ecology and growth, a green economy as a way of fixing the environment, and something Germany could excel at, engineering solutions, ways of building new economies, even around renewable energies that, have clearly contributed to reducing carbon emissions, but at the same time also generated other sorts of environmental problems. So there's a lot to discuss there, of course, even though on balance, I guess we have to see that as something positive. But so you have that on the one hand, but on the other hand, you have this grassroots activism, and that's actually responsible for a lot of the change that does happen. So when the conservative government under Chancellor Kohl passes a law saying that you can feed renewably generated electricity into the German electric grid if you build your own wind turbine, and you get a set payment for it, their imagination was nothing is going to happen. The reason something happened was because a lot of people took the initiative to build their own wind turbine or to put up their own solar panels, because, in part they were motivated by concern about the environment. In part, they also saw, okay, this is a guaranteed good investment. I have land here. I'm able to build a wind turbine, and I know this investment will pay off because I'm guaranteed this amount of payment for every kilowatt hour of electricity I produce. But these people were on the grassroots level acting independently. They didn't do so because the government forced them to. The government didn't force the utilities to do anything. It was individuals. So again, going back also to this story about Wyhl in the Southwest, that's one place where renewables have really taken off, and it's because people on the grassroots bottom-up level got involved. So I completely agree with you on many aspects of what you said, but I see some nuance there also. So thank you very much for those comments and questions.
If I may, before we turn to you, I think it's interesting again to underscore we're looking at dynamics of grassroots. Pat underscored the sort of bureaucratic formation. We're talking about party formation here as part of a kind of dynamic in which then on top of it the corporate economic logics are operating, are intervening here, and this kind of grassroots activity keeps compelling things forward. I'll just add provocatively that in the United States, Richard Nixon created the EPA, Helmut Kohl, the ministry, the Ursula von der Leyen. So all, just with the European Green Deal, there is a way in which part of this dynamic gives credit to the conservatives for actually putting forward political solutions, even if they're being pushed, as you just said, Stephen, by the grassroots activity, which itself may be neither right nor left, but driven by certain kinds of interest and opportunities. So that's a little bit of a kind of summing here. Do you want to add in?
I can do both. So just to be, more provocative, inspired by the notes as we go further back and look at the United States, who started the were the founding fathers of the American Environmental Movement, started the Sierra Club, the National Park Service, it was run to Teddy Roosevelt and Associates. It was Madison Grant was one of the original thinkers who also wrote the book, The Passing of the Great Race, so the Bible of the race replacement theory. And the legend has it when Hitler was in jail, he read, for the first time, he read the Passing of the Great Race and wrote Madison Grant a letter saying that this book is my Bible. So this anecdote has been repeated. I mean, I'm looking for this letter. I'm not being able to find it yet, but this is quite interesting history there. But kind of to answer Sabine's question about China, I think environmentalism in China has a long history, and then if we were focused on the PRC, the People's Republic of China, 1949, so socialist developmental policies were hugely detrimental to the environment, and environmentalism wasn't really a thing because development was kind of the center of the national attention. And then the 1972 was a turning point in the PRC because the People's Republic of China joined the United Nations, and the first meeting they went to was the Stockholm Conference, and then they came home with this notion that the environment is important. This was when China wanted to be a part of the international community, right, a part of the liberal and international order, if you will. So then they kind of brought a lot of those ideas, human rights, environmentalism, back to China, and then they started to build this ministry. What eventually became the Ministry of Environmental Protection, today the Ministry of Ecology and Environment in China, kind of from scratch. So there wasn't an environmental bureaucracy at the time, so they picked kind of officials from the Ministry of just random Ministry of Health, and then SOEs, and then have them kind of form this office on the management of 3 wastes. And then eventually that grew into China's environmental protection bureaucracy today. And then if you look at kind of the writing, government policy documents on the environment, even from the 70s, was really interesting that at least in terms of the in the realm of policy thinking, they very much recognized kind of, we have to not repeat the mistakes of the West, which is pollute first, clean up later. But then, of course, when it was an opportunity for you to develop your economy as as reform started to happen, it was really hard to say no to GDP growth. So then China followed the steps of the, what they call pollute first, clean up later model. And then you're right that around the 2007, especially the Beijing Summer Olympics, and the year before that, you had the athletes training in Beijing and complaining about air pollution, and then got coverage in the New York Times and so on and so forth. And then you sort of see, and then back then Twitter was blocked, and then the U.S. Embassy in Beijing started to tweet out hourly air quality data, and then Chinese people started to look at this and then realize, what we thought was fog was actually smog, and it's actually bad air pollution, and then that became a huge deal, and there was huge middle class outcry over several years, and then culminating in this January 13, 2013, or January something, 2013, New York Times headline about the air apocalypse in Beijing, when air pollution PM 2.5 level became, I think, exceeded the upper limit of the meter that detects air pollution. And then the government eventually started to deal with air pollution problems. And then you can see notable improvements in air pollution, in air quality in China. Of course, there is a distributional issue because a lot of the factories relocated to the inland area. So then now we confront the question of just air pollution in big cities have improved, and overall it's improved, but the distribution, the inequality of environmental pollution became an issue. And then what's really interesting is that in recent years, and especially after 2008, when the trade war started, people's attention dramatically shifted. With kind of the slowing down of economic growth, and I would say you see, if not the collapse of kind of the urban middle class environmental movement, the petering away of that, or at least it's kind of in the background now. And what was, what used to be considered, there was this documentary called Under the Dome. It was about China's air pollution. When it first released, it was played, billions of times, and Chinese citizens were kind of, giving it approval and replaying it, and it was, very much welcomed, and in China, and immediately it later on, just within several months, and if not, it became kind of, Western conspiracy trying to sabotage China's economic growth. And similarly, Donald Trump during the campaign said, right, climate change was the Chinese hoax that tried to sabotage American economy, right? So you see the taking over of those conspiracy theories, and that's because people's attention now is on the economy, which, you could kind of sort of see the citizenry, even in a non-democratic society, as a single issue voter, when the economy is really kind of at the forefront of things now. And then now, when we, at least when I look at public opinion in China, you see this more clear left and right spectrum, if you will, with the environmentalists being the liberals, and the conservatives, or the right in China, which is what we will call actually the left in China is kind of right here. It's kind of confusing. Whereas the conservatives in China, would say economy first, and then environmentalism is this liberal value that's not, that's not what we believe in. And then there is obviously the urban-rural difference. And I think the key difference there is that for the urban middle class, environmentalism could be said as this kind of post-material value, as the term in political science we use to describe the values that people supposedly acquire after they have their economic and material needs met. But I think in the rural areas, in China and elsewhere in the global south, there isn't this clear distinction between the material and post-material. For a lot of people, for instance, part of my research is in Mongolia. So if you look at kind of the way climate change is affecting Mongolia and a lot of the herders, then the environmental is the material. So then for them, they, I don't know if there's kind of bottom-up movement amongst the rural populations of the global south, but there's clearly this kind of concern that maybe expressed through their own language and then dealt with in their own ways. And so the pattern might look different from what urban middle class environmental movements would look like. And then this actually, kind of going back to what Stephen was saying, perhaps is what actually would make right-wing or conservative environmentalism appealing to these rural populations, precisely because they think about those questions somewhat differently, and they are, more, I think the connection between kind of traditional values, and environment and nature is drawn more easily by population in rural areas. I think there is environmentalism, perhaps in a very different shape and form, for people in rural areas.
I think it's interesting. We've gone from a small corner on the Rhine all the way up into this macro level, and I think one of the things that's interesting also in the narrative that we're developing here is the way that, say, in the 70s, there might have been discrete things that people were responding to: pollution, biodiversity, as we would call it today, the death of forests, acid rain, these kinds of things. But now, if those could be dealt with in a discrete fashion, part of the reason why in a conversation on Europe we have to talk about China is precisely because this is a global dynamic, right? And the response has to be a global response. And I think one of the things that you're also charting out is the way that these kinds of institutions that are at the supranational level have been an important player here, right? And I will just add in that, interestingly, in the European context, the European Green Deal was often phrased as to make us competitive vis-a-vis China, right? And so there's a way, again, going back to this understanding of politics, its relationship to economics, and it's also a relationship instead of cooperation to competition in the global structure. You know? But Pat, Sabina had posed some questions before. I'm wondering if you wanted to jump into the conversation here, either respond to what's been said or directly to Sabina.
We're running short on time, but two remarks. First, I do want to express appreciation to Isa for reminding us that China's first United Nations meeting was the Stockholm Conference, and to think of the implications of that over time is very striking to me. The discussion on growth in the early 1970s was especially that of the Club of Rome, which was a group of businessmen and economists and so forth who tried to make a general argument for the value of limiting rather than maximizing economic growth. And they accompanied it with an economic model that was done at MIT to try to make the case. Well, it just didn't take. Partly simple disagreement amongst all of those who in the economic world who saw the priority as being growth no matter what. But second, that the model was a primitive model and did not have the data or the logic to really answer the questions that were raised by the proposal for limiting growth. And that absence of adequate economic work on the functioning of the world economy is still a problem. Our own group at the World History Center got a brief grant from the National Science Foundation, but could not get further funding to explore it. We don't know the answers on how the world economy functions, but the question of growth has been articulated most formally from 1972 to the present. In any case, I see this as reinforcing Randall's remark just now that we have to learn how to carry on our discussion at a frighteningly complicated level. But sounds like a good start to me all the same.
Well, I appreciate what you said before about the 70s as being the first time where we're really bringing together our knowledge of environment, including tectonic plate shifts and continental drift, which I just thought everybody, but everybody always know that, and I mean, and so on the one hand, the need for the awareness of the environment, and as you're pointing to, the need for the awareness of the complexity of the economy in its relationship here. Sabina's already noted that we should have economists at the table, and we will have a subsequent conversation focused on economics, especially with the degrowth agenda, which is very difficult at this point in time to discuss. But is there any, so I would invite further questions here from the group. Yeah.
I had a clarifying question for you. Sure, my name is Benjamin Pratt. My question was, when you were discussing the response to the New York Times article about pollution in Beijing, you had mentioned that there was outcry from the middle class. My clarifying question is where?
Yeah, I would say in all over China. So, I was in China working on my PhD dissertation at the time. That was on environmental governance in China. I remember on Chinese social media, so you kind of, get up in the morning and you open, the Chinese equivalent of Instagram, and then you'll see kind of pictures of, people on their way to work, and they take pictures of, what's in front of their car, which is nothing, just kind of gray, right? So people complain about air pollution. So I would say pretty prevalent all over urban China. And then, and you don't see that as much anymore.
Thank you.
Even though, I mean, air quality has on average improved, but then, in the winter, because Beijing's geographic location, sometimes you still have days that are very, very polluted. But you don't see kind of complaints at this scale. Yeah.
Let's see, we'll go this way, and then over to you. Do you want to just state your name and?
Yeah, so my name is Mitchell Machine. I'm a student at Pitt studying neuroscience in German. My question is for Dr. Izzetting. So over the summer, I found myself in Germany, Heidelberg, for a study abroad program. And one of the excursions that we went on was to this place called the Dienststätte. So this place it's like a big theater that was built during the Nazi era to put on propaganda plays. And part of the conversation we had when we were discussing this was why the location? Because it's in the middle, it's like we did an hour-long hike up to it. We kind of physically fit to get to it. And even just to go there, it was kind of why would you want to build something that's supposed to have the purpose of giving propaganda so far away but with surrounded by nature. So my question with this is, why do you briefly mentioned before with purity and with paganism and everything, but could you further explain what is this specific appeal with the people who are alt-right and with people who are alt-right, conservatives or whatever? Why would they build something like this in this area where there is so much nature out?
Well, back then they were just the far right. They weren't the alt right.
Yeah, now if there's a movement like this, they do think build something there.
But a kind of pilgrimage to a place remote or out of distance where nature is.
Yeah, and I think, there's so much to say about this. I think part of that is I would say today, or I think I don't want to completely equate people today, even though they might derive their inspiration still from some of the original thinkers, is the anti, this disenchantment with modernity. That's been a constant theme, I think, throughout, I would say since the Industrial Revolution. And it's again this feeling, we all sometimes feel disenchanted, right? So we sometimes feel, social media is too much, right? So there's solution and everything. And I think it comes down to, for a lot of people who are, feel like they might be, today losers during globalization and so forth, right? There's a lot of kind of anti-industry and even anti-business, right? So again, they don't necessarily have to be kind of stereotypical Republican or pro-business, pro-industry, and then kind of retreating back to the land, back to soil, and then we kind of so those kind of longings, I think, and again, we can kind of go back to the Romantic movement and blood and soil, nation. So it's I think there is psychological and individual psychological with explanations for this, and I think everybody could sort of see that, and then there's the more specific explanation tied to national history, German national development. That's oftentimes kind of vis-a-vis what's happening in France, vis-a-vis what's happening in Britain, and then this notion that the formation of German national identity is kind of about their nature and about the unique landscape of the German nation, and so on and so forth. So again, kind of nature and being in nature is a very, very important part of just not kind of Nazi ideology. I think it's kind of the formation of the German nation.
And in general, it's an aspect of nationalism as such, right? It's some claim to a relationship of land and people. So.
Yeah.
Stephen, do you want to add anything to this conversation about far right pilgrimage sites or?
I mean, I don't think I have anything too specific to say about far-right pilgrimage sites, but there's a lot of great research on sort of the Nazis' relationship to the environmental movement. And it's a really interesting and complicated story that, you know, is in part having to do exactly with these issues about ideology and ideas about where the German nation comes from, but also having to do just sort of with, you know, a politics that's seeking to bring different groups of people on board and that's open to kind of finding ways for ecologists to fit in and ecologists wanting to join in with the ruling regime rather than being, you know, sent into irrelevance by not going along with it. So I would really recommend this edited volume, How Green Were the Nazis. It's a great book to look up, like, you know, just some of the debate about this.
I think it's interesting we're focused on Germany, but we could go across to France and we could see other kinds of formations there, but similar sorts of phenomenon, et cetera, from place to place, each in their relationship to their nature. What I think I'm going to do, because I've also heard and had the 5-minute warning sign 2 minutes ago, so I'm going to actually collect 3 questions and then we'll see if we can get some answer here. So maybe just go here in order. Do you want to start?
Yeah. I'm Mr. Lee, and I first want to make a comment because we talk about creating solutions. So there was a time like Twitter wasn't blog at also Facebook doesn't blog at that time. So Jack Dorsey went to China and he wants to show his like relationship between China people. So he chose to join Tiananmen Square. But that day was a serious pollution day. You can see the sky was in the green color, and we also the air pollution never broken the limit. We also always say like mercury report says 500, but the truth is the upper limit is 500. So that day we call him the most expensive air purifier in the world. So that was yes, that was really news in that time. And also I want to back to our theme, like after like I hear so much question and so much knowledge about this, I'm still confused like where should we put environmentalism to like politics, like is it like or like neutral, like because we mentioned some like far things like rational purity or social Darwinism, but I still think like there's hard to connect them with environment. So I still confused on this.
No, that's good. That's unfortunately a big and difficult question. Can we? No.
I'm Anthony Malak. I'm a freshman here at Pitt and majoring in law. I actually had a question for you earlier. How earlier in this panel you said that you attended like a debate between students at Pitt, like Republicans and Democrats, and how they argue about everything except when it came to whether or not like there is a problem with like the environment in today's day. I just want to go off of, do you think it's more like a generational issue between like older and younger generations? Because like older generations seem to like debate the fact whether or not it's real or not way more often than younger generations. And do you think that as younger generations like move into offices, like in future generations, do you think that question will kind of like die out? And not really the question of like the method of fixing the environmental issue, but really whether or not it exists. Do you think it will eventually die out?
That's something also, Stephen, we can address to you, but the political solution and its generational component. We're dying out, and you'll turn us into soil and green. Erica, do you want to?
No, I'm good. You kind of, mine was going to come back just to this idea that, this harkening back to nature was not exclusive to Germany or Nazis. And this is a fundamental aspect of make whatever country, in certain country made great again by that far right, is that idea that they're harkening back to this nostalgia of the past, and part of that nostalgia is the beauty of nature and what nature has provided in the past.
So before we're at time, and I just want to observe that our next conversation on October 8th will be with on the question of ecocide and climate we'll have one of the Klimaseniorinnen, in English, they're often translated as the climate grannies who won the case against the Swiss government. And we'll be looking at legal challenges that are being posed. On the 24th in our series Beyond the Ballot, we'll be doing a wrap-up of EU elections and general European concurrent elections. Are you, okay, even the German ones?
No, we're well, we might put them in, but right now we have people
So hot topics.
UK and Brazil. Yeah.
So I don't know, Stephen, do either of you want to begin with a response? And it's very brief though, because otherwise Ingrid's just going to pull the plug.
Yeah, I'll very quickly, like I agree, this is totally not unique to Germany. In fact, another case I'm looking at is Mongolia, becoming pure nostalgia and purely land and blood. So it's a thing that's not even unique to the global north, if you will. And of course, when it comes to the global south, another related interesting question emerges. Then how do we even think about the far right in the global south, right? So how do we even think about that? Because usually those are the victims of imperialism and colonialism. And anyway, to answer your question, which is, will the issue die out? My guess is the issue will certainly change and evolve into solution to that. And I mean, there's no doubt there's going to be people who still believe this is a conspiracy or this is not real. But I think according to Pew survey, at least the majority of the people in their 20s actually believe climate change is real. And then you can kind of just Google and find this huge difference, kind of generational difference amongst people who would identify as conservative or Republican. I can't be sure like which one it is. So yes, I think. And then the other thing that was really interesting that was in the debate is that when it came to the policy solution aspect on both sides, and I don't know if that's representative of the younger population in the United States, is that both are fine with nuclear energy as a solution to climate change. So, yeah.
Except for in the US, it will not die out because we don't get Congress.
Stephen, do you want to give us some last words? Do you want to help Winston and all of us understand the political solution here? And I'm not trying to be light of it. That actually sounds like I'm being flippant, but I'm not. I mean, I do think that fundamentally, it's an interesting question of if all environmentalists claim something of being out front, and yet there are various qualities. Where do we look? What do we do?
I mean, yeah, I think it's a great question, and I don't have the single answer, but my perspective on it is that, I mean, I think if you look at the most radical initiatives of the climate movement, which I, find very compelling, they're about, radical change to the way that we live. And I think those may be one way that we would solve the crisis that we face, but there are also things that are relatively unlikely in the short term, at least, to happen. And where we see some movement happening is in sort of smaller scale solutions, things that come from the grassroots up that don't look like they could ever possibly confront a global problem. But it seems to me so important that those initiatives continue, that people work on them, that they actually do contribute something towards changing the way that we think about how we live and to, lowering our collective carbon footprint and all of these things that may, in the long run, make more difference, or in the short run that we need to be so focused on right now, than tilting at windmills, as much as I sort of personally agree with, some of those ideas about what sort of radical change we need.
So the looking to open up the small qualitative transformations that might become quantitative transformations for the Earth. But I think, Winston, back to your question, I'm going to say one of the things I heard here in this conversation goes back to something that Isa said at the opening. Are we supporting, say, Enlightenment values, if you want, of universalism, humanism, equality in this, or are we actually cosmopolitanism is something that you cited, or are we seeking to move out into pure tribal units that are ultimately in some kind of competition with each other for dwindling resources. Do we want a world of no borders in which we're culpable and responsible for everybody in every space on the planet? Or do we want to say the zombies are at the gate, we'll be shooting them in the brains as they try to take away what few things I have? And it seems to me that those are perhaps, again, I'm not trying to be flippant, but I'm a film scholar, and I look at what images we have of our future. They're often zombies attacking us, or people shooting themselves off into rockets out into space in an Elon Musk fantasy. And I prefer to think of us as living in a world in which we can move towards collective solutions. And that's imperative for all of us to live the best lives for our future. So with that, I'm going to call this to an end. And I really appreciate the contributions and the presence of everybody in the room. Thank you.